Now that you know how to measure angles, let's talk about how to use those measures by using a couple of postulates and definitions. Here are the postulates that we want to use: the segment addition postulate and the angle addition postulate. The segment addition postulate says that if you have a segment A, B, C, and B is between A and C, then taking segment AB and adding that to segment BC will give you the entire segment of AC. The angle addition postulate is just like that. If you have point D in the interior of angle EOF, notice we have point D here in the interior of angle EOF, then the measure of angle EOD plus the measure of angle DOF is equal to the measure of angle EOF. Basically, both of these postulates say if you add two pieces together, you get one great big thing. Let's try using these two postulates. Before we begin, it's important to notice that our postulates do apply. Here we have segment WY with X in between W and Y. Therefore, the segment addition postulate applies. Also, down here we have angle RQT with point S in the interior. So therefore, the angle addition postulate applies. In our first problem, we are told that the distance from W to Y is 59. And now if we use our segment addition postulate, that tells us that the distance from W to X plus the distance from X to Y has to equal the distance from W to Y. Now let's substitute in the values that we know. The distance from W to X is given to us 8x minus 14. We'll add that to the expression for xy, 4x plus 1. Of course, that has to equal the total length, 59. So now let's do some quick algebra here. 8x plus 4x is 12x, and negative 14 plus 1 is negative 13, and that has to equal 59. If we add 13 to both sides, 12x is going to equal 72, so that tells us that x is equal to 6. We're not done, because we were asked to find the length of segment WX. We know WX is equal to 8x minus 14. Let's now substitute in what we know. Well, we just found out that x is 6. So if we do some quick arithmetic here, we get 34. So the distance from W to X is 34. Now let's do the same thing with the distance from X to Y. We know that that is 4x plus 1. So we will substitute in the value that we know for X. And now we do our arithmetic that goes along with that. xy is equal to 25. Now it's important to note here that 25 plus 34 is 59. Now for the next one. We are told the measure of angle RQT is 155 degrees. So we are going to use the angle addition postulate, and we're going to take the measure of angle RQS, and we're going to add that to the measure of angle TQS. And of course, that will give us the measure of angle RQT. So just like we did last time, we're going to substitute in the values. 4x minus 20 and 3x plus 14, and that has to equal 155 degrees. Doing some quick algebra here, 7x minus 6 is going to equal 155 degrees. So if we add 6 to both sides, then 7x is going to equal 161. So if we divide that by 7, we get 23. So x is equal to 23. So the measure of angle RQS is going to equal 4 times the 23 minus 20. The measure of angle RQS is going to equal 72 degrees. The measure of angle TQS is going to equal 3 times 23 plus 14. So the measure of angle TQS is going to equal 83 degrees. And once again, I want you to note that 83 degrees plus 72 degrees happens to equal 55 degrees. This is a good way to check. This is where you press pause, do these problems on your own, and when you have your answers, you can press play to check and make sure your answers are correct. Excellent. Let's go ahead and see how well we have done. By setting up your equation and solving for x, you should find out that x is equal to 9. Segment JK has a length of 42, and KL is equal to 78. Now, since angle DEF is a straight angle, that tells you it's 180 degrees. So using that, you should have been able to find out that x is equal to 14. The measure of angle DEC equal 142. And the measure of angle CEF is equal to 38. And of course, both of these are degrees. How did you do? Let's just do a really quick definition here. The definition of congruent simply states that two figures are exactly the same in every corresponding feature. Now notice that this deals with figures, as in segments, or angles, or squares, or rectangles, or triangles. We're not talking about numbers. The symbol for it can easily be written by writing an equal sign and then putting the little squiggly over the top. It's called a tilde if you want to know. Segments only have one feature to them, and that is their length. So segments are congruent if they have the same length. And angles only have one feature to them, and that is their measure. So angles are congruent if they have the same measure. We mark congruent figures in a couple of different ways. For example, we can say that segment AB is congruent to segment BC by using tick marks. The same thing can apply for segments that aren't connected. And the more congruent parts you have in figures, the more tick marks you use. For angles, we use arcs. So we can put an arc near the vertex of angles to indicate that they are congruent. Here, angle O is congruent to angle D. Also, if they're connected, it's just fine. And with angles, the more arcs you use, you can denote different pairs of congruent figures. Let's try putting this idea of congruent to work. Are segment AC and segment BD congruent? To do this, let's go ahead and find out if AC, the length, is equal to BD. The coordinate of A is -2, and the coordinate of C is 5. The length of AC is going to be the absolute value of -2 minus 5. That will be the absolute value of -7, which is a +7. So now let's look at segment BD. How long is that? Well, the coordinate of B is 3, and the coordinate of D is 10. So the absolute value of 10 minus 3 is equal to the absolute value of 7. And of course, the absolute value of 7 is +7. So yes, the lengths are equal. That tells us that segment AC is congruent to segment BD. Notice that when we use the segments with the segment symbol above it, we use the congruent symbol. And when we use the lengths without the segment symbol above it, we use the equal sign. For question number 6, we're told that angle GHI is congruent to angle KLM. Well, the definition of congruence says that their measures are equal. If they're congruent, then their measures are going to be equal. Since we know that the measure of angle GHI is 54 degrees, we also know that the measure of angle KLM is 54 degrees. It's now your turn to try this on your own. Press pause, and when you have your answer, press play to make sure you are correct. So you have your answers? We know that segment AB is not congruent to segment DE. The fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter which order you subtract the numbers in. Because of the absolute value, the answer will never be negative. So you will still come up with a length of 7. Here's another easy one for you to do. Press pause, press play to make sure you're correct. So you have your answer? Excellent. The measure of angle DEF has to be 49 degrees because the angles are marked as being congruent. Another quick definition, midpoint. Midpoint is a point that divides a segment into two congruent parts. So in this figure, point B is the midpoint of segment AC. And another definition. A bisector is a point, line, ray, segment, or plane that divides a figure into two congruent figures. So if you think about it, a midpoint is a bisector. We can get more specific with segment bisector. A segment bisector is a point, another segment, a ray, another line, or even a plane that intersects a segment at its midpoint. And let's not forget angles in all of this. An angle bisector is a line that goes through the vertex of the angle, or a ray with an endpoint at the vertex of the angle, or a segment with an endpoint at the vertex that separates the angle into two congruent angles. Let's try using the concept of midpoint. You will notice that we are told that point Q is the midpoint of segment PR. That means that segment PQ is congruent to segment QR. That means that segment PQ is congruent to segment QR. Using the definition of congruent segments, that means the distance from P to Q is equal to the distance from Q to R. We can now write our equation. The distance from P to Q is 6x minus 7, and the distance from Q to R is 5x plus 1. If we subtract 5x from both sides and add 7 to both sides, we find out that x equals 8. However, that's not what we were asked to find. Let's go up to the top now and look at our question here. What are PQ, QR, and PR? We can quickly find PQ because we know that that's 6x minus 7, so substituting in the value that we just found for x, we can do some simple arithmetic and find out that PQ is equal to 41. Likewise, we can do the same thing with QR. We can quickly find out that QR is also 41. Now, using our segment addition postulate, the whole segment, PR, has to equal PQ plus QR. That makes PR 82. Alright, now let's look at an angle bisector. Here we are told that ray AC bisects angle DAB. If it helps, create a figure. Here is angle DAB. Ray AC is a ray that begins at point A and separates angle DAB into two congruent angles. Now we know that angle DAC is 58 degrees. The angle has bisected. That means that the measure of angle BAC has to also be 58 degrees. Using the angle addition postulate, it tells us that angle DAB is 116 degrees. Now it's your turn to work out a couple of problems. Press pause. When you think you have your answer, press play and check to make sure you are correct. So you have your answer. Number 12, the answer there is no. Because we know that point Q is the bisector of segment PR, we know that QR is going to be the same length as PQ. For number 13, how did you do? Now try one more problem using an angle this time. Press pause. When you have your answer, press play and double check to make sure you are correct. By drawing a figure and setting up an equation, you can find that angle HFV is equal to 36 degrees. How did you do? And that is the end of the lesson. Press pause, copy down these questions and the figure, and when you're ready, press play to move on to the next slide to get the last few questions. Here are the last few questions for this lesson. Please make sure you have them done and have any questions ready to ask when you come to class. Thank you, and enjoy.